In Britain, they started off by telling us that 8 million people would need to go into hospital and 500,000 people would die. There was much talk of fighting and war and the Spanish flu of the early 20th century and the Black Death plague, which killed around half of the people in Europe. The coronavirus was made a notifiable disease and put into a special category, along with rabies and Ebola, and the doom-mongers had a field day. Much the same happened elsewhere around the world. Panic was suddenly in fashion. But right from the start, it all seemed wrong. The figures weren't right. Back in February, on my website, I suggested that there were hidden agendas. Since then, everything I've said and written has been proved absolutely accurate. Everyone seems to forget that ordinary, old-fashioned flu can kill 650,000 people a year globally, and in the UK alone, it regularly kills tens of thousands. So why was this coronavirus, COVID-19, so very dangerous? Well, it quickly turned out that it wasn't. On March the 19th, the UK government's advisory committee of experts decided that the coronavirus didn't deserve to be classified as a high-consequence infectious disease, and they put it back into the flu category where it belonged. You'd have thought that governments would then have backpedaled a little. But no, not a bit of it. A few days later, the British government put the UK into lockdown. And many other countries had already done the same thing. Even though the bug had been downgraded, the government didn't say, "Oh, sorry folks, we got a bit overexcited there." Instead, they took a 358-page emergency bill out of a drawer, where they just happened to have it ready, and put most of the country under house arrest. They called it lockdown, but it's effectively house arrest. How handy that they just happened to have that 358-page document giving them all sorts of powers ready. And the experts had just downgraded the bug. The government was relying on a bloke called Neil Ferguson, who does forecasts based on mathematical models. He's professor of mathematical biology at Imperial College in London. And on the basis of his advice, the politicians decided that we should be locked in and subjected to social distancing rules. Has this bloke got a great track record? Well, not exactly. This is what the government knew about Ferguson when they decided to put all their trust in him and his team. First, in 2001, the Imperial team did the modelling on foot and mouth disease, which led to a cull of 6 million sheep, pigs and cattle. The cost to the UK was around billion pounds. But the Imperial's work has been described as severely flawed. Second, in 2002, Ferguson predicted that up to 50,000 people would die from mad cow disease. He said that could rise to 150,000 if sheep were involved. In the UK, the death total was 177. Not 1,000, just 177. In 2005, Ferguson said that up to 200 million people could be killed by bird flu. The total number of deaths was 282 people worldwide. In 2009, Ferguson and his colleagues at Imperial College advised the government, which, relying on that advice, said that the swine flu would kill 65,000 people in the UK. In the end, swine flu killed 457 people in the UK. Finally, Ferguson has admitted that his model of the COVID-19 is based on undocumented 13-year-old computer code that was intended for use with an influenza epidemic. No one seems to have questioned Ferguson's work on COVID-19, despite the fact that if he's wrong again, which I believe he is, the nation will be pushed back into the dark ages as a result of his work. As far as I know, his work has never been peer-reviewed. When I started to criticise the government's stance, I was vilified and lied about with great enthusiasm. And I don't allow adverts on my videos, but someone's put a plug for the government's website on them. There used to be a time when questioning the government was considered to be a good thing. No more. Telling the truth is now apparently unacceptable. The British government, for example, has announced that it intends to treat anyone who tells the truth about vaccination as a terrorist. So much for free speech. In future, people won't dare speak out, and free speech will be nothing but a memory. A few years ago, I was banned in China. I never thought it would happen here, but I can feel it coming, and it's scary. I tried to open an account on Facebook for the first time, and I was told that I couldn't, in order to protect the Facebook community. If the Facebook community really needs protecting from me, then they've got big problems. My critics, and there seem to be a great many of them, including, it seems, the UK government, might like to look at the list of accurate warnings and predictions I've made in the years gone by. I was the first author to write about the excessive power of the drug companies in my book The Medicine Men in 1975. I was the first doctor to warn about the danger of the benzodiazepines in a series of articles and TV programs in the 1970s. I warned about badly organised medical research in a book called Paper Doctors in 1977. I was the first doctor to warn that stress could cause massive harm to the human body in a book called Stress Control in 1977. I was the only doctor to rightly judge that the government's warnings on AIDS were wild exaggerations. In 1988, I was the first doctor to warn about the demographic problems caused by an ageing and increasingly sick population. And in the 1990s, I wrote about the link between meat and cancer. All of these things caused a great deal of controversy, but nothing quite like what's been happening recently. I've also written and broadcast against animal experiments and about vaccination. And I'm no longer allowed to broadcast about those issues, not because I was wrong, but because I won every public debate I ever took part in on radio and television. The opposition was happy to debate with me until they started losing the arguments. Incidentally, most animal experiments, this is just an aside, but most animal experiments are done by drug companies as part of their testing programs. And most animal experiments commonly show that animals develop cancer or other serious disorders when they're given prescription drugs during that testing period. But the drugs are still prescribed for human patients. And the argument the drug companies make is that animals are different to people, so the results, the fact that they develop cancer when given the drugs, don't count. Think about it. Excuse me for suggesting that my track record's a bit better than Ferguson's, but I think it's an important point to make, given the amount of controversy that's going on the internet, particularly at the moment. Small diversion. The result of the Ferguson-inspired lockdown is that tens of thousands of patients with cancer are not being treated. And even the government has admitted that more people will die because of the lockdown than will die of the coronavirus. The government's own guess is that 150,000 people will die in Britain as a result of the lockdown. Their guess, 150,000. My guess is much, much higher. The coronavirus isn't going to kill anywhere near that many, even with fiddled figures. And I know how painful this is for those involved. My wife had treatment for breast cancer last year, and the surgery and radiotherapy have left her with a very painful shoulder. She desperately needs physiotherapy. She had one session, and that's it. The hospital's closed. Millions of people are terrified out of their wits. I've massive respect for the shop assistants and delivery drivers and others who are working on. Some of them are scared. In one shop I saw an assistant dressed as though ready for an operation. She wore a gown, an apron, a hat, a mask and surgical gloves. Power-crazed police have made things worse. A supermarket delivery driver told me that he was stopped while driving his delivery truck and asked to explain the purpose of his journey. And the government continues with the lies and the deceit. They can't stop, perhaps because they realise that if they admit they screwed up, then they'll all be looking for new jobs. Every day they produce new figures showing that the coronavirus has killed many people. Not as many as the ordinary flu perhaps, but many people. But those figures aren't true. Many people who die of cancer or heart disease are being put down as coronavirus COVID-19 deaths to boost the figures. We're being told that people are dying in care homes. Well, I'm afraid people in care homes are often near the end of their lives. That's why they're there. Every year, 600,000 Britons die. That's over 11,000 a week. Every week, every year. The key is to look at the overall number of deaths, and when you do, it's clear that the total death rate is much the same as it always is. The only difference is that everyone is now officially dying of coronavirus. Meanwhile, in Britain, we have more empty ITU beds than there were before the scare started, and nearly half of the NHS hospital beds are empty, and the big new hospitals that they've built with such great publicity are empty or damn near empty. And here's something else that you might not know. Back in March, Professor Ferguson, the government's advisor, who I've already mentioned, admitted to the House of Commons Science and Technology Committee that up to 2/3 of the people who would have died from the coronavirus in the next 9 months were likely to have died from some other cause anyway. So the official figure for the coronavirus deaths can sensibly be cut to 1/3. There are only two conclusions from all this. Britain and the rest of the world are being run by incompetent buffoons who've managed to hoodwink unquestioning journalists. That's one possibility, and it's very possible. The BBC, for example, has been a propaganda machine ever since the organisation started taking millions of euros from the EU. You knew about that, of course, didn't you? If the press reported every time someone died of ordinary flu, we'd all live in constant terror, or simply ignore their reports. But can politicians really be as stupid as they sound, or are there hidden agendas? I've compiled a list of 12 ways in which governments will benefit from all this nonsense, 12 hidden agendas. The first of my 12 hidden agendas is that people have been turned against one another. One police force has even asked citizens to report material on the internet which might radicalise members of the public. In other words, material which might encourage them to reject the status quo and to question the validity of our having been turned into a police state. It seems that it's now considered illegal to tell the truth if by doing so you embarrass the government. If you believe in free speech, then you might find that worrying. I seem to remember the Chinese, the Soviet Union and the Nazis had rather similar policies. Other hidden agendas? Well, we've been turned into recluses who tend to be fearful and obedient, perfect for a police state. The elderly have been clearly marginalised. We've been prepared for regular compulsory vaccination. And whatever you think about vaccination, does everybody really believe in compulsory vaccination? That's the beginning of a very long road. We're all going to be impoverished and less independent than we were before. Cash is probably going to be outlawed. Freedom of speech will soon be a memory. Churches have been shut and people deprived of spiritual comfort. Inconveniently small businesses, always a target for the EU, which, heavily lobbied by big industry, doesn't like small businesses, they're being destroyed. Taxes will rise massively. Governments will have far more power than ever before, and so on. My list of 12 hidden agendas appears in far more detail on my website, www.vernoncoleman.com. There have been serious attempts made to hide the site, but it's still there at the moment. There's one easy way for the politicians to prove that there aren't any hidden agendas. Sack Ferguson, forget the social distancing rules, and abandon the lockdown. Now, not at the end of the month, not next month, now. And then there may be a hope that we can salvage something from the mess they've made of the world. Thank you for watching.